The 13th Secret. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday that felt like the end of the world. Chen stared at the cream-colored envelope in her trembling hands, her name written in elegant script that belonged to another century. The return address made her blood freeze. Blackwood Estate, Ravens Hollow, Maine. Her grandmother had been dead for 3 years. Impossible, she whispered, but the postmark was yesterday's date. The wax seal, deep burgundy with an intricate symbol she'd never seen before, remained unbroken. Sarah had received exactly 12 letters in her lifetime from grandmother Elena, one on each birthday until she turned 12, then nothing. No explanation. No goodbye. Just silence that stretched across the years like a chasm neither of them had tried to bridge. Now this, the 13th letter. Her hands shook as she broke the seal. The symbol seemed to resist, as if the wax itself didn't want to yield its secret. When it finally cracked, she could have sworn she heard something. A whisper, a sigh, the sound of a door opening in an empty house. Inside, a single sheet of paper and something else. A key, old brass, worn smooth by countless hands, with teeth that formed a pattern too complex to be accidental. The letter was brief. Dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then the first secret has been revealed to you. You are ready for the inheritance I could never explain while I lived. The other 11 secrets wait in the house. Find them before the winter solstice, or they will be lost forever, and so will you. Trust no one in Raven's Hollow. They have been watching. They have been waiting. The key opens what was never meant to stay closed. Your loving grandmother, Elena Blackwood. Sarah's coffee grew cold as she read the letter 3 more times. Each reading brought new questions that made her skin crawl. Trust no one. They have been watching. What did that mean? She'd never been to Raven's Hollow, had never even known her grandmother owned property there. After Elena disappeared from her life, Sarah's parents had refused to speak about her, deflecting every question with uncomfortable silence. But now she had to know. The key felt warm in her palm, almost alive. As she studied it, she noticed something carved into the metal, so small she almost missed it. Numbers, 1 of 13. 11 secrets wait in the house. 1 key in her hand. 12 more to find. Sarah looked at her watch. October 15th. The winter solstice was December 21st. 2 months to solve a mystery that had been buried for longer than she'd been alive. She called in sick to work, threw a bag together, and was on the road to Maine within an hour. Something told her that waiting even a day would be a mistake she couldn't afford to make. The drive north took 8 hours through increasingly desolate countryside. As afternoon faded to evening, the GPS led her down roads that seemed to exist in defiance of logic. Winding, narrow paths that doubled back on themselves and led through forests so dense they blocked out the dying light. When she finally saw the sign for Raven's Hollow, population 847, she almost missed it. Someone had scratched out the numbers and written "unknown" underneath in red paint that looked suspiciously fresh. The town itself appeared around a bend like something from a fever dream. Victorian houses with windows like empty eyes lined streets that formed a perfect spiral leading to a central square dominated by a clock tower. The clock face showed 11:47, but Sarah's watch read 6:23 p.m. She drove slowly through the eerily quiet streets. No people on the sidewalks. No lights in windows. No signs of life except for a small inn with a flickering neon sign that read "The Watching Glass." She parked and approached the inn, the key still clutched in her sweating palm. The front door opened before she could knock. "Sarah Chen," said the woman in the doorway. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes the color of winter ice. "We've been expecting you." How do you know my name?" The woman smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Everyone knows everyone in Raven's Hollow. Dear, I'm Margaret Thorne, proprietor. Your room is ready. I didn't make a reservation. Room 13 has been reserved for you since 1987. Margaret stepped aside with fluid grace. The year you were born. Sarah's mouth went dry. She wanted to run, to get back in her car and drive until she hit civilization. But the key in her hand seemed to pulse with warmth, urging her forward. The inn's interior was a maze of narrow hallways and antique furniture that looked expensive and wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate a Victorian mansion from half-remembered dreams. Oil paintings covered the walls, portraits of stern-faced people whose eyes seemed to follow her movement. These are the previous caretakers of the Blackwood Estate, Margaret explained, noticing her stare. 12 generations. You'll be the 13th. I don't understand. You will. Margaret handed her an old-fashioned skeleton key. Room 13 is on the 3rd floor. The Blackwood house is 3 miles north on Hollow Road. I wouldn't recommend going there tonight. Why not? Margaret's smile returned, cold and knowing. The house isn't ready for you yet. But don't worry, dear. Tomorrow, when the clock strikes 12, it will be. Sarah climbed narrow stairs that creaked with each step. The hallways seemed to stretch longer than physics should allow, lined with doors bearing brass numbers that didn't follow any sequence she could understand. Room 13 stood at the very end, isolated from the others. The key turned with a click that echoed too loudly in the silence. The room was small but comfortable, with a view of the clock tower through lace curtains. On the nightstand sat a leather-bound journal and a pen that looked centuries old. The first page was already inscribed in the same elegant handwriting as the letter. Day 1. The first secret is the key itself. Hold it to the moonlight and remember what you've forgotten. Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the brass key to the window. Moonlight streamed through the metal, and suddenly the key wasn't just a key anymore. Symbols appeared along its length. Constellations, runes, patterns that hurt to look at directly. And with the symbols came the memory. She was 5 years old, sitting in her grandmother's lap, while Elena whispered stories about a house where time moved differently, where secrets lived in the walls and waited for the right person to set them free. A house that protected something so important that 12 families had died to keep it hidden. But what is it, grandmother? 5-year-old Sarah had asked. The 13th secret, little star, Elena had whispered. The one that will either save the world or end it. Sarah gasped and nearly dropped the key. The memory faded, leaving her dizzy and confused. Had that conversation really happened, or was the house already playing tricks on her mind? Outside, the clock tower began to chime. 12 resonant notes that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. As the last note faded, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, stopping right outside her door. The doorknob began to turn. Chapter 2. The Watchers. Sarah grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, the heavy leather journal, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door. The knob turned with deliberate slowness, as if whoever was outside wanted her to hear every click of the mechanism. The door swung open on silent hinges. No one entered. Sarah waited, heart hammering, but the hallway beyond remained empty. After what felt like an eternity, she peered around the doorframe. The corridor stretched into darkness, lit only by a few flickering sconces that hadn't been burning when she went upstairs. On the floor just outside her room lay a small white envelope. Sarah snatched it up and slammed the door, turning the deadbolt with shaking fingers. The envelope bore her name in the same elegant script, but this time the paper felt different, older, more fragile, as if it had been waiting decades for her to find it. Inside was a photograph and a single line of text. The photograph showed the Blackwood house. Even in faded sepia tones, it was magnificent and terrible, a Gothic mansion that seemed to defy architectural logic, with towers that twisted toward the sky and windows placed seemingly at random across its facade. But it was the figures standing in front of the house that made Sarah's breath catch. 12 people in Victorian dress, arranged in a perfect circle around a 13th figure at the center. The central figure wore a hooded cloak that obscured their face, but Sarah could see their hands clearly. In the left hand, a key identical to the one she now carried. In the right hand, something that looked like a human heart, still beating. The text below read, "The First Watchers. The Last Hope. 1873. Sarah flipped the photograph over. More text, written in a different hand. Younger, more desperate. "They're not dead. They never died. They're waiting in the house for you to complete the circle. Don't trust the key. Don't trust the house. Don't trust anyone who claims to know your grandmother's secrets. There's still time to run." A friend. Sarah's mind raced. Someone was trying to warn her. But about what? And who were the watchers in the photograph? She studied their faces more carefully and felt a chill of recognition. The stern, angular features looked familiar, not individual faces, but the same bone structure repeated across generations. She thought of the portraits lining the inn's hallways. The same cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes, the same cold smile she'd seen on Margaret Thorne's face. 12 generations. That's what Margaret had said. Previous caretakers of the Blackwood Estate. Sarah looked at the key in her palm, then at the photograph. The hooded figure's key looked identical to hers, but something was different about the hand holding it. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at wrong angles, as if the bones themselves had been reshaped by whatever power they'd been guarding. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Chen." Margaret's voice, sweet and concerned. "I brought you some tea. Thought you might be having trouble sleeping." Sarah said nothing, hardly breathing. "I know it's overwhelming, dear. All the family stories, all the history. But don't worry about the warnings. Every generation gets them. People who don't understand what you're meant to do." Another soft knock. "Your grandmother faced the same doubts, the same fear, but she learned to embrace her destiny, just as you will. The house is waiting for you, Sarah. It's been waiting for so long." Sarah heard footsteps retreating down the hall, but she didn't trust it. She wedged a chair under the doorknob and spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching the clock tower and thinking about the photograph. As dawn broke over Raven's Hollow, she made her decision. She had to see the house, had to know what secret was so important that 12 generations of people had devoted their lives to protecting it. But first, she needed answers. She found Margaret in the inn's dining room, serving breakfast to an impossible number of guests for such a small town. Sarah counted at least 20 people, all eating in perfect silence. They looked up in unison as she entered, their eyes tracking her movement to a corner table where Margaret had already set out coffee and eggs. "Sleep well?" Margaret asked, pouring coffee from an antique silver service. "I had some interesting reading material." Sarah pulled out the photograph. "Care to explain this?" Margaret's smile never wavered, but something flickered in her pale eyes. "Family history. Your grandmother was very interested in genealogy. This was taken in 1873. My grandmother wasn't born until 1945. Time works differently for the Blackwood line, dear. You'll understand once you visit the house." Sarah looked around the dining room. Every single guest was still staring at her, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths. None of them had aged since 1873, she realized with growing horror. The same faces from the portrait, preserved by whatever power lurked in the Gothic mansion. "You're all watchers," she whispered. Margaret's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp. "We prefer guardians. And we've been very patient, Sarah, waiting for you to come home. This isn't my home." "Oh, but it is. It has been since before you were born. Since before your grandmother was born. The Blackwood line is bound to this place, to the secret it contains. You can't run from what you are." Sarah stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound broke whatever spell had been holding the other diners motionless. They resumed eating in perfect synchronization, as if nothing had happened. "I'm going to the house," Sarah said. "Of course you are, dear. We'll be watching." The words followed Sarah as she fled the inn, got in her car, and drove north on Hollow Road. The forest pressed close on both sides, branches forming a canopy so thick that it blocked out the morning sun. The road seemed to stretch forever, winding through landscape that looked increasingly wrong. Trees with bark that pulsed like skin, clearings where the grass grew in perfect spirals, streams that flowed uphill. When the house finally came into view, Sarah had to pull over and catch her breath. It was exactly as the photograph had shown it, but somehow larger, more imposing. The Gothic architecture seemed to bend reality around itself, with towers that twisted into impossible geometries and windows that reflected not the sky, but something darker. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if the house itself were breathing. Sarah approached on foot, the brass key growing warm in her hand. With each step, she could feel the weight of watching eyes, though she saw no one. The very air seemed thick with anticipation, as if the house had been holding its breath for decades. At the front door, she hesitated. The warning from the anonymous note echoed in her mind. There's still time to run. But she'd come too far to turn back now. Whatever secret her family had been guarding, whatever power had preserved the Watchers for over a century, she had to know the truth. Sarah raised the key to the lock and felt it turn with surprising ease. The door swung open silently, revealing a grand foyer lit by candles that flickered without any apparent source of flame. On the floor just inside the entrance was another envelope. And another key, this one silver, with 2 of 13 engraved on its surface. As Sarah stepped across the threshold, she heard the door close behind her with a soft, final click. From somewhere deep in the house came the sound of footsteps. 12 sets of feet, walking in perfect unison, getting closer. Chapter 3. The House of Hours. The footsteps stopped just as Sarah pocketed the second key. The silence that followed was worse than any sound, a pregnant quiet that seemed to press against her eardrums. The candles lining the foyer flickered in unison, their flames bending toward a corridor that stretched deeper into the house. Sarah opened the second envelope with trembling fingers. The second secret lies in the room where time forgot itself. Follow the broken clocks to the heart of the house. But remember, every step forward is also a step back. The Watchers can only follow where you've already been. She looked around the foyer more carefully. Now she could see them, clocks everywhere, built into the walls, hanging from the ceiling, standing in corners. Grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, pocket watches suspended on golden chains. All of them showed different times, and all of them were running backward. The largest clock, a magnificent piece with a pendulum that swung in defiance of gravity, chimed once. Then all the other timepieces joined in, a cacophony of chimes, bells, and ticking that should have been deafening but somehow felt muffled, as if the sound were traveling through water. As the chiming faded, Sarah heard something else. Music. A waltz played on what sounded like a music box, tinny and distant, coming from deeper in the house. She followed the sound down the corridor, past portraits that watched her with eyes that moved in their frames. The faces were all unfamiliar, but there was something about their expressions, a mixture of sorrow and warning, that made her want to apologize for disturbing their eternal vigil. The music grew louder as she walked, joined by other sounds. The rustle of silk dresses, the whisper of dancing feet, muffled laughter that had an edge of hysteria. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed a ballroom where shadows waltzed without partners, their movements creating a wind that stirred curtains on windows, showing not the outside world but other rooms in the house, creating an infinite regression of watching and being watched. Sarah hurried past, following the broken clocks. Their backward progression seemed to guide her deeper into the house's impossible geometry. Rooms opened onto other rooms in ways that defied architectural logic. Staircases led both up and down simultaneously. Doors opened onto corridors she'd already walked, but changed. Mirrors where windows had been, windows where walls should exist. The music box melody grew stronger, and Sarah realized she recognized the tune. Her grandmother had hummed it sometimes, during those precious 12 birthdays before the silence began. A lullaby about a girl who danced with time itself and learned the secret of forever. The melody led her to a door marked with the symbol from her grandmother's wax seal. The brass key from the first letter fit perfectly, turning with a click that seemed to echo through dimensions she couldn't name. Inside was a study that belonged to no era she could identify. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines bearing titles and languages that hurt to read. A desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with charts, diagrams, and photographs that showed the same Gothic mansion in different states, sometimes whole, sometimes partially collapsed, sometimes overrun with vegetation as if it had been abandoned for centuries. On the desk lay an open journal, its pages covered with her grandmother's handwriting. Sarah read with growing disbelief. Day 4387. The house grows stronger. The boundary between the real world and the space between grows thinner. The watchers speak of acceleration, the approach of the convergence they've been preparing for since 1873. I understand now why each generation is allowed only one chance. The power required to maintain the seal increases exponentially. Elena Blackwood was not my grandmother's name. It was the name I chose when I accepted the 13th key. Sarah flipped through pages that documented decades of observations, experiments, and growing desperation. Day 4401. The children born in Raven's Hollow no longer age normally. They grow to maturity, then begin aging backward until they vanish entirely. The town is becoming unstuck in time. I don't know how much longer I can hold the seal. Day 4420. I've found the loophole. The 13th generation doesn't have to guard the secret. They can change it. But only if they understand what they're truly choosing between. I pray Sarah will be strong enough to make the right choice. Day 4444. This is my final entry. Tomorrow I fake my death and begin the long wait. The watchers must believe they've won, must believe the line is broken, or they'll never allow Sarah close enough to reach the 13th secret. If you're reading this, granddaughter, know that I'm sorry for the burden I'm passing to you, but also know that you're the first in 13 generations with the power to end it. Sarah's hands shook as she turned to the final page. The 13th secret is not what the watchers think it is. They believe it's a key to immortality, a way to preserve themselves and their vigil forever. They're wrong. It's a choice, to let time flow naturally and allow death its due, or to freeze this moment forever and trap not just Raven's Hollow, but the entire world in an endless loop of watching and waiting. The third key is hidden where the house remembers what it used to be. Look for the room that shows only truth. Sarah closed the journal and looked around the study more carefully. Every surface was covered with mirrors of different sizes and ages. Some silver-backed glass that showed her reflection clearly, others made of polished metal that distorted her image, and some that seemed to be made of shadow itself and reflected nothing at all. But there, almost hidden behind a stack of books, was a mirror that showed not her reflection but the room as it truly was. Without the books, without the furniture, without the careful staging. Just empty space and a single pedestal in the center, on which rested a key made of what looked like crystallized time. Transparent, but somehow solid, shifting between different eras as she watched. Sarah reached toward the mirror and felt her hand pass through its surface as if it were liquid. On the other side, her fingers closed around the third key, and the moment she touched it, the house around her began to change. The study dissolved, replaced by a vast circular chamber with 12 alcoves carved into the walls. In each alcove stood one of the watchers from the photograph, but they were no longer dressed in Victorian finery. Now they wore hooded robes that seemed to be cut from the same darkness that filled the spaces between stars. "Welcome home, Sarah," they said in unison, their voices creating harmonies that resonated in her bones. "You've done well to make it this far." "I'm not home," Sarah said, clutching the 3 keys. "This isn't my house. All houses are temporary, replied the figure in the center alcove, the one who had been holding the beating heart in the photograph. All families are borrowed. All time is an illusion. We offer you truth. What truth? That death is not the end. It's the pause between movements in an eternal symphony. We've learned to conduct that symphony, to decide when the music stops and starts. Join us, and you'll never lose anyone again. Never say goodbye. Never face the terror of endings. The hooded figures stepped forward in unison, and Sarah could see their faces now. Margaret Thorne, the other guest from the inn. People she'd never met, but somehow recognized from childhood nightmares she'd forgotten. Your grandmother fought us for 50 years, Margaret continued. But in the end, even she understood. The 13th secret isn't about choosing between life and death. It's about choosing between chaos and control. We offer control. And the price? There is no price. Only transformation. Take the 13th key, speak the words of binding, and become what you were always meant to be. Guardian of the threshold. Keeper of the eternal moment. Sarah looked at the 3 keys in her palm. According to her grandmother's letter, there should be 13 total. Where are the other 10? The watchers exchanged glances. There are no other keys, Margaret said carefully. There never were. The 13 secrets are metaphorical, stages of understanding, not physical objects to collect. But even as she said it, Sarah could feel the lie. The keys in her hand grew warm, and she heard her grandmother's voice, not from memory, but as if Elena were standing right beside her. Don't believe them, little star. The keys are real, and you need all 13. They've been hiding the others for over a century because they know what happens when someone collects them all. They know that the 13th secret isn't about controlling death. It's about choosing life. Sarah backed toward what she hoped was still a door. If there are only 3 keys, then this should be easy to prove. Give me the other 10, and let's see what happens. The watchers didn't move, but the air around them began to shimmer with heat and malevolent intent. The keys are dangerous in the wrong hands, the central figure said. Your grandmother learned that the hard way. Do you want to know how she really died, Sarah? What happened when she tried to use the 13th key without understanding its true purpose? Sarah's blood chilled, but she kept backing away. Tell me. She opened a door that should have stayed closed. She let time itself bleed through, and it nearly destroyed everything. We stopped her, but at great cost. The town, the house, even we ourselves, we're all that stands between the world and temporal chaos. We are the guardians. We are the heroes of this story. Sarah's back hit something solid, not a door, but another mirror. Through its surface, she glimpsed a different version of the circular chamber. One where the alcoves were empty and the floor was covered with what looked like discarded keys, all of them tarnished and broken except for 10 that gleamed with inner light. Liar, she whispered, and stepped backward through the mirror. Chapter 4, The Shattered Hours. Sarah tumbled through liquid glass into a version of the chamber that felt more real than anything she'd experienced since entering the house. The air here didn't shimmer with magic or menace. It simply was, solid and honest and heartbreakingly normal. The 10 keys lay scattered across the floor like fallen stars. Each one was different: gold, silver, copper, iron, and materials she couldn't identify. Some were ornate, others simple. All of them bore numbers: 4 of 13, 5 of 13, and so on up to 12 of 13, and finally one marked simply 13. Sarah gathered them with trembling hands, and as her fingers closed around the 13th key, the world exploded into clarity. She was no longer in the circular chamber. Instead, she stood in a small bedroom that smelled of lavender and old books. Sunlight streamed through windows that showed a garden where roses bloomed in impossible profusion. An elderly woman sat in a rocking chair by the window, her silver hair caught up in a loose bun, her hands busy with needlework that looked suspiciously like a map of constellations. "Hello, little star," Elena Blackwood said without looking up from her sewing. I wondered when you'd finally make it through their lies. Sarah's voice came out as a croak. Grandmother? Not your grandmother, child. That woman died 3 years ago, just as the newspapers reported. On the echo she left behind. A memory preserved in the space between seconds, waiting for you to find the keys that unlock truth. Elena set down her needlework and turned to face Sarah. Her eyes held depths that spoke of years beyond counting, but her smile was warm and entirely human. Sit down, dear. You must have questions. Sarah sank into a chair that materialized as she needed it. The Watchers said you nearly destroyed the world, that you opened a door that should have stayed closed. I opened a cage that should never have been built. Elena picked up her needlework again. Definitely a star map, Sarah could see now, with constellations connected by threads of silver and gold. Tell me, what do you think the 13th secret is? The Watchers said it was the choice between chaos and control, between life and death. Close, but not quite right. It's the choice between freedom and safety, between accepting uncertainty and living in fear of it. Elena held up her needlework, and Sarah could see that it wasn't just a star map. It was a portrait of the town of Raven's Hollow, showing its spiral streets as celestial bodies in an impossible constellation. The Watchers discovered something in 1873 that terrified them beyond reason. What? That death is not the end. That time is not linear. That every ending is also a beginning, and every beginning contains infinite possibilities. Elena set the needlework aside. They saw the chaos of existence, the beautiful, terrible randomness of life and death and rebirth, and they decided to stop it, to create a pocket of controlled time where nothing ever truly changes. Sarah looked at the 13 keys in her palm. Each one pulsed with a different rhythm, like individual heartbeats. But the house, the town, all those people, they seemed real. They are real in their way. Preserved moments, crystallized experiences, lives caught in amber and fed by the fear of what comes next. Elena stood and moved to the window, looking out at the impossible garden. The Watchers weren't evil, Sarah. They were afraid. Afraid of losing themselves, afraid of uncertainty, afraid of the vast, unknowable mystery that surrounds all existence. So they trapped themselves in a single moment. They trapped themselves, yes, but also everyone else in Raven's Hollow. And their influence is spreading. Haven't you noticed how the world outside has become more predictable lately? How people seem more afraid of change, more willing to accept comfortable lies than difficult truths. Sarah thought about her own life before the letter arrived. The same job, the same apartment, the same routine day after day, chosen not because it made her happy, but because it felt safe. The cage is getting bigger, much bigger. In another generation, maybe two, their version of controlled time will encompass everything. No more surprises, no more growth, no more death, but also no more life. Just endless repetition of safe, familiar patterns. Elena turned back to Sarah, and her expression was fierce with hope and determination. But you have the keys now. All 13. You can choose differently. What happens if I use them? The cage breaks. Time flows naturally again. Death becomes possible, but so does real life. Real change. Real growth. Elena's voice softened. Real love. Real loss. Real meaning. Sarah looked at the keys, then at the woman who wasn't her grandmother, but felt like family anyway. What happens to you? To the Watchers? To everyone trapped in the controlled time. We face the uncertainty we've been avoiding for over a century. Some of us will find peace. Some will face the endings we've been postponing. And some, the younger ones, the ones who were caught in the cage rather than building it, will get the chance to live lives they never imagined possible. Elena sat down across from Sarah, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I won't lie to you, child. Using the keys means accepting that you can't protect everyone, that people you care about will suffer and die and make mistakes. It means giving up the illusion of control in exchange for the reality of freedom. Sarah thought about the photograph from 1873, about the hooded figures who had seemed so menacing but were really just people too frightened to let go. They'll fight me. They're already fighting you. But their power comes from the cage itself, from the controlled time, the predictable patterns, the safety of never having to face real uncertainty. Once you break that cage, they'll just be people again. Scared, confused people who will need to learn how to live with real time and real choices. Sarah stood up, the keys warm in her palm. How do I do it? How do I use all 13 keys? Elena smiled, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the grandmother Sarah remembered from those long-ago birthdays. You already know, little star. You've always known. The keys aren't tools you use. They're permissions you give yourself. Permission to choose uncertainty over safety. Permission to accept endings so beginnings can happen. Permission to let go of control and trust in something larger than fear. And then you live your life. The real one, not the safe one. You make choices that matter because they can go wrong. You love people knowing you'll lose them someday. You create something beautiful and temporary instead of something eternal and empty. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the 13 keys in her palm dissolve into light. The light spread up her arms, through her body, until she was glowing with the accumulated power of 13 generations of choice deferred, 13 chances to break free that had been postponed until this moment. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the circular chamber again, facing the 12 watchers. But now she could see them clearly, not as immortal guardians, but as people who had been frozen by their own fear, preserved by their unwillingness to face uncertainty. Sarah, Margaret Thorne said, and her voice was no longer cold and commanding, but small and frightened. Please, we've worked so hard to keep everything safe. I know, Sarah said gently, and I'm sorry, but safety isn't the same thing as being alive. She raised her hands, and light poured out of her like sunrise after the longest night. The watchers threw up their arms to shield their eyes, crying out in voices that were human and vulnerable and terrified. The chamber began to crack. The house began to shake. And through the spreading fissures, Sarah could see something impossible and wonderful. The real world, flowing with real time, full of real people living real lives that were messy and uncertain and absolutely, beautifully alive. Chapter 5. The Choice of Hours. The cracks spread like veins of light through the chamber walls. And with each new fissure, Sarah heard something that made her heart soar, the sound of time moving forward. Not the measured tick of controlled seconds, but the organic rhythm of life itself, irregular, unpredictable, full of pauses and rushes and moments that mattered because they would never come again. The 12 watchers huddled together as their eternal vigil crumbled around them. Margaret Thorne looked up at Sarah with eyes that were no longer pale winter ice, but warm brown, confused and frightened, but undeniably human. What have you done? Margaret whispered. I've set you free, Sarah said. All of you. The chamber shuddered and began to collapse, but instead of crushing them, the falling stones transformed into something else, memories. Sarah saw flashes of the watchers' lives before they'd chosen safety over uncertainty. Margaret as a young woman in 1873, laughing at a dance, spinning in the arms of someone she loved. Others celebrating birthdays, mourning losses, making choices that led to joy and sorrow in equal measure. They'd all been alive once. Really alive. The house gave one final shudder and simply let go. The Gothic mansion with its impossible architecture dissolved like sugar in rain, leaving Sarah standing in a field of wildflowers under a sky that showed the real world beyond Raven's Hollow. The town was still there, but transformed. The spiral streets had become a normal grid. The Victorian houses looked lived in rather than preserved. And the clock tower showed the correct time for the first time in over a century. Sarah looked around for the watchers and found them scattered through the field, no longer wearing hooded robes, but simple modern clothes. They looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable. Human. Margaret was the first to approach. She moved hesitantly, as if walking were a skill she had to relearn. "I remember now," she said softly. "I remember why I was so afraid. My daughter."